Okay, let's talk about transit column or transit formation for a moment. The normal default formation for a unit is deployed, and that's what we're looking at here. The three core companies of the battalion side by side facing in the direction of the battalion, and attached companies wherever you like really, but normally tucked away behind. The point is it's a wide flat formation facing forward, ready to fight in that direction. And this is the formation that most units spend most of their time in. But there is another formation called transit column, and that's used, as it suggests, for moving about more efficiently. It takes half a move to transform from deployed to transit, or vice versa, and the transit formation is essentially long and narrow. In other words, you put the three core companies one behind the other. You can do what you like as usual with the attachments. You can put them behind, you can put them in front. The point is you create a column, and there are two bonuses to having a transit column. One is that you can go through narrower gaps. So if you imagine we've got two woods close together, if the battalion was deployed widthwise, it wouldn't be able to fit through that gap, and therefore it would, as it moved forward, it would have to suffer the movement penalties for moving through the woods. In transit column, as you can see, it can move through, so it can move at its normal movement rate. The other bonus that a transit column can obtain is road movement. So if you have a road on your battlefield, then the transit column is the only formation that can benefit from a road presence. If you are in deployed formation, you're too wide to use the road, basically, and so you get no benefit from it. But if you are in transit and you're on a road like this, then you get a 4-inch bonus to your movement. So the 4 inches is only if you're on a road and you're in transit. The only other thing I should mention about transits in terms of movement is that there's a special case for cavalry. Cavalry in transit column get a bonus to their movement. I think it goes up from 10 inches to 18, because a wide formation of cavalry is particularly unwieldy. So getting into column helps them a lot. They also get an extra 4-inch bonus if they're on the roads. Other thing I should say about the transit column is fighting. It is a poor formation for fighting in, and most units, most types of formation cannot fire in transit column at all. The one exception to this is turreted vehicles, so tanks, some tanks, destroyers, maybe anti-aircraft vehicles and armoured cars. They can fire to their flanks in transit column, but they will fire with a suppressed die. So whatever their die that they use when they're in suppressed mode is also the die they will use when firing out of a transit column. So it is something that you need to use normally behind the lines, and you need to avoid, if at all possible, being engaged in combat while in this formation.
Okay, so having looked at transit column and reminded ourselves of how that's handled, let's look more generally at movement. Just as a reminder, the movement phase each turn occurs after the artillery and air bombardment phase, but before the fire combat and close combat. And movement also incorporates the morale recovery, the removal of disorder markers, because that's when you roll the colour decision die for each of your formation groups. Now, I've covered those colour dies in another video, and at the end of rolling each one, you will have for each of your formation groups a number of moves, a number of units that you can move. Sometimes, quite often in fact, this will be fewer than the total number of formations in your force group, and if that's the case, then clearly you're going to have to decide which ones move and which ones stay still. If you do better on your colour dice, you will also have some auto rallies, which will remove some extra disorder markers, and in exceptionally good cases you may even have 1 or 2 free moves, which means that a formation which has already moved once can then move again, effectively getting 2 moves. One thing that's not quite clear in the rules, I certainly don't play it this way, is whether a free move allows you to remain stationary to remove a disorder marker and then move, as it were, afterwards in a free move. I don't allow that to happen, but the rules aren't quite explicit. So one way or another, you've decided which of your formations are going to move. You have removed disorder markers where appropriate for, as I say, stationary units, but also for being regular or elite and so on, for having decorated leaders and other reasons. And you're now ready to move your formation. Formation movement is relatively simple. As I've already shown you, there's two formations, either the special transit column or the more general deployed. And units simply move the number of inches shown here in the tactical movement factors for infantry, the standard 4-inch move. They can move 7 inches if they move double time, but then they can't move the next turn at all. Everybody, as I've said, gets a road bonus of 4 inches if they're on a road for the whole move and they're in transit column. The various other adjustments here, that centre column includes some terms, light vehicles, heavy vehicles and so on, which you'll find in the equipment tables. So for light tanks can move faster than normal and heavy tanks are slower. Special movement rules there for cavalry. I've honestly never used cavalry in any of the scenarios, but there's rules there for them. Horse-drawn wagons and so on. So all of that is fairly, as you would expect, fairly clear. You move across the terrain a number of inches according to the type of troop and some special circumstances. There's a little table there for additional modifiers, essentially for the quality of your troops. Elite troops, SS, can move an inch further, hardened 2 inches, militia less. That again may seem odd. Why do those types of troop actually go quicker? And the answer is, again, it's not because a man can move farther or a tank can drive quicker. It's because these are battalions being ordered and moved about on the battlefield, and the more experienced and more dedicated troops are better at moving under fire. There'll be fewer laggards, the officers and NCOs will have less trouble getting them to move. So that's why there are adjustments to the movement for the quality of the troops. The large table there is, again, what you might expect for modifiers to movement. So if you're moving uphill, you lose 1.5 inches for each level. You obviously have to assign your hills levels, or that may be done in the scenario. Something that's worth mentioning, the asterisk against some of these movement penalties. So if you're crossing a wall or a hedge line, a gully or a stream, they both say -2 inches. Well, the -2 inches is simple enough. You have to deduct 2 inches from the movement of the formation as it crosses. The asterisk means that it has no effect on foot troops, but if you've got a wheeled or tracked vehicle formation, then you roll a d4 and you add that many disorder markers to the formation. And the idea there is that these are not casualties, they're not destroyed vehicles or anything, but as I've said several times, disorder is about the cohesion and coordination of the unit, and as it's moving through a wood or crossing a linear obstacle, troops get disorganized, they lose formation, they lose concentration. Some of them may cross more quickly than others. Maybe a vehicle does get stuck on a hedgerow or something. And there's generally a bit of grit in the command machinery, and those disorder points represent that. So in an extreme case, a unit could actually become suppressed because of disorder caused by moving through difficult terrain, and that's appropriate. That means that their fighting capabilities have been substantially reduced because perhaps they're going through a heavy wood or a destroyed town section, and they've essentially lost a lot of their cohesion. So that asterisk, as I say, applies to all of the movement adjustments that you can see there, which have asterisks against them. Woods there you'll notice as light, medium and heavy. Those will be determined by the scenario. The protection factor of a wood and the difficulty of moving through it are very clearly very closely connected. A light wood might be thin willows or some sort, which offer little more than visual protection. A heavy wood might be extremely dense ancient forest with large trees, which provide a lot of cover against incoming fire, but also make it difficult to move through with vehicles, tanks or lorries and so on. So the movement is essentially fairly simple. Remember all the time that this is based on large formations moving over a period of a substantial amount of time, half an hour, an hour. So movement is much more determined by the combat effectiveness of the force and how it's coordinated on the battlefield. And that's the other reason for the final thing I want to mention, which is if you are more than 24 inches or centimeters in the smaller scale from any enemy unit, then you can move at double speed, and that represents again a reduction in the need to find cover, to throw out scouts and so on. If you're further from the enemy, then it is easier to move more quickly with a large unit, and therefore the strategic movement, as it were, when you're a distance from the enemy is doubled. I think that's about all for movement. I'll move on now to do a little video about terrain in general.